Tucker Carlson
has spoken to Putin.
Tucker Carlson showed up in Moscow this week.
Sparks frenzied speculation.
Turned out to be anything but an interview.
I've said this before.
Does anybody think that he was going to be tough on Putin?
You're such a dick.
The Tucker Carlson interview with Vladimir Putin is the most significant interview of the 21st century. The interview has been watched over 1 billion times, and the response from American conservatives is surprising.
I thought Tucker did fine. Asked some interesting questions.
Called Evan a hostage. That was bold of him.
A huge portion of American conservatives saw it as the leader they want. Here's a guy who is well-spoken, has what seems to be a deep understanding of history, who has a beautiful capital city, and who also supports traditionalist values. Tucker himself visited the Moscow metro, grocery stores.
He is amazed by the cart.
And even Moscow's bread selection.
Look at that. Look at that. Come on.
Heralding each as an example of Russian supremacy over the West. There's just one problem with this. The only way Russia is able to make any of this happen is through totalitarianism. The Russian Supreme Court classified the LGBT movement in Russia as an extremist organization. And then, only a month ago, Putin executed his main political opponent, Alexei Navalny, and brutally arrested women who simply put out flowers, while also regularly imprisoning people in the country for simply using the word war. Is criticizing Russia about stuff like this perhaps a double standard on our end? Wouldn't America be better off if LGBT rights were scaled back dramatically and sexual deviance on apps like TikTok criminalized? Is perhaps the West completely full of shit when it comes to criticizing Putin for Navalny's death and push people like Julian Assange to the brink of death? Joining me to discuss this today is the philosopher and YouTuber Michael Millerman, who has one of the most fascinating channels on YouTube I've come across over the past 3 years. Michael, thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
What did you think about the political discussion after the Tucker Carlson interview? Was it surprising to you to see so many Americans and conservatives in America who traditionally are all about small government essentially applaud an authoritarian?
Yeah, well, you know, the response to the interview, it shows us just how much Russia occupies a prominent place in the conservative imagination at the moment. Because even though conservatism traditionally supports small government, the current state of affairs in American ideology and somehow in global Western liberalism sets Russia up as a genuine alternative on the spiritual, moral, ideological, and even in some sense, intellectual front. And it's strange because it's involving conservatives in a kind of situation where they have cognitive dissonance. They don't necessarily hate America and love Russia. So for example, Carlson himself, he went on Glenn Beck's show and explained what he was trying to accomplish when he showed videos of the Moscow subway station and so on. He said that his goal was to shame American elites. Like, how can such a great country as America let its cities become so decrepit and degenerate and degraded, where you have drugs on every corner and people overdosing everywhere? And, you know, Jon Stewart, when he was commenting, said that that's the price you pay for freedom. So this is introducing a kind of cognitive dissonance. Like, you want good things for your country and for your people. You don't want to see a moral decline, which people are witnessing in the United States. And even at the level of leadership, they see Vladimir Putin, who can explain his position over a long historical arc. Now, some people like that, some people don't, but conservatives see it, I think, and wish that they had a leader with some ability, some dedication to his cultural heritage, and some historical comprehensive knowledge and understanding. They see that all of that is lacking in the United States at the level that we're familiar with through the most egregious examples of it. You know, so Russia, regardless of the reality of life in Russia, regardless of the reality of Putin's rule, you know, he represents at the moment an alternative in the moral imagination for conservatives. So I thought that was pretty amazing. And another thing is that conservatives have gotten used to liberals declaring war on culture, civilization, history, tradition, religion, identity. And they like it whenever they see an example of somebody who's not doing that. But again, the challenge for them is to navigate this cognitive dissonance between what we can learn from a foreign leader's example at the level of moral imagination and so on, versus, well, how do we incorporate those insights in America without becoming traitors and without undermining everything that's great about the United States, which after all is not the same as Russia. Even if you go down to their roots, it can't be a replication of the Russian system. It has to be something distinctly American. But yeah, it's a fascinating reaction. The fact that the interview got as much attention as it did, the fact that people who, including Tucker Carlson himself, wanted this conversation to happen were accused of being stooges or apologists, whereas actually it's more complicated. People are trying to find a model that they can look up to, that they can replicate, that they can use to understand, and they have good reason for wanting to do that. The two extremes are over-exaggerating everything that Russia gets right and America gets wrong, and on the other hand, saying that Russia is pure evil and America can do no wrong. And so it's a tough moral position for people who are trying to think it through, and yet that's what we have to do.
Based on what you said and sort of what I've seen over the last couple of weeks, it seems to be the case that, it's less of a reaction in support of Russia and more of a reaction against liberalism and the disappointments people are finding in the West with liberalist societies. And I think my next question for you is, why do you think people dislike liberalism as much as they do? After all, didn't liberalism give them all of the things that they enjoy now?
Yeah, so we have the extreme version of contemporary globalist liberalism, leading to things that seem on their face so absurd that you would never imagine a healthy civilization to allow things to stoop so low. So one thing is the kind of reduction to absurdity of liberalism, and therefore a desire to find some meaningful alternative to it, despite the fact that we have high living standards, despite the fact that we have cheap technology, despite the fact that you have all of these kinds of freedoms at a commercial level. It comes to many people at the expense of a certain sort of depth, and never mind issues like encroachments on privacy and the constant hypocrisy and being lied to by people who are in control of global liberalism. So there's that kind of issue. But another one is the worry that, look, part of what seems to go together with liberal ideology is undermining attachments of a narrower kind, attachment to family, attachment to place, attachment to one's people or nation, and in some cases, attachment to one's country or civilization. You see the exaggerated version of this, for example, in the Google Gemini AI scandal, where if you asked it to say something nice about Western civilization or European peoples, it would completely shut you down and show you that the American founding fathers were a Chinese people, for example, or something like that. So people see the fact that liberalism has gone crazy at that level, and they have to ask themselves, what's the price that we pay for our material well-being if it comes at the expense of everything else that's important to us in life? So it's its own version of the what does it profit a man if he gains the whole world but loses his soul question. Liberalism gives you something, but it also takes something away from you, and people have to weigh that in the balance. Then another component, I would say, which relates to the Putin and Tucker interview pretty directly, is that at the moment it seems like the Western world in its fight for freedom, quote unquote, and its fight for liberal principles and values and all of that is engaged in proxy warfare in the Russia-Ukraine battle because of all the money that the United States and other countries have to send to help keep that war going so that Ukraine is a viable contender in it. And so there's sort of the thought or the worry that, look, on one hand, you're removing us from our particular bonds, like patriotism is considered a bad thing, some sort of national identity is considered a bad thing, and so on. And you're taking all of the rich resources that we have and using them to support foreign wars, foreign battles, foreign countries, without it being obvious to the ordinary citizen what benefit there is to him from billions and billions of dollars going to support liberalism internationally through this conflict and related conflicts. So that, I would say, distance that's produced between the people and the ruling elites, and that the ruling elites try to force in to the lives of people through the various systems, through media systems, through education systems, through the new technology systems, like I say, you saw with the Gemini AI. And it leaves you believing that you're being robbed of something precious. So I think that's the feeling that the people who are suspicious about liberalism, again, it doesn't necessarily mean that they want to live in a totalitarian government. They may think that liberalism is its own kind of totalitarianism, that it's encroaching on privacy left and right and so on, and that it's exerting a certain kind of absolutism over permitted thought and permitted speech. But even so, it may not mean that you support the alternatives, but you just know that there's something rotten going on with the status quo. And I think that explains why there are a lot of young right-wing anti-liberals, some pro-American, some anti-American, trying to figure out where to turn to for inspiration and where to turn to for an alternative. Some go to older philosophers like Nietzsche, some go to contemporary philosophers like Alexander Dugin, Carl Schmidt. They're all looking for a viable account of man's place in this world, in his political community, and in his own skin that doesn't necessarily map onto the liberal interpretation of those levels.
I think in terms of people looking for different philosophies to hold on to, I think the reason they're doing that is one critique of liberalism is that by allowing for all voices to be equal in society, you essentially destroy the possibility of greatness, right? Like as an example, a trad chad on the internet are arguing that if only we could legislate against sexual promiscuity and LGBT rights, a new renaissance of the nuclear family could lead us towards something like societal stability that might make something like exploring the universe a real possibility again, rather than focusing on avoiding misgendering a child who identifies as a cat. So I guess my follow-up question then is, has liberalism led us to a point where we've lost ourselves in the pursuit of equality and kind of abandoned the idea of greatness altogether, and thus it's causing a lot of young conservatives to look for alternatives?
Yeah, it's been a while now since people have been taught that everybody is equal with respect to things that you wouldn't normally want to factor in. But the issue is that people see the hypocrisy of this. So for example, if you wanted to say, look, this person has accomplished great things because he has intellectual capacity, he has verve, he has passion and energy and ability, and it's a good thing for there to be excellent people in the human race. But somebody would say, no, you know, what you're calling excellence is their privilege, accident of birth. You know, it's actually not good that we valorize these people or idolize these people or that we would want to support them in any specific way. So there is implicitly the view that, okay, and there's truth to this view. So one of the things that we have to remember, I think, as we look over the ideological field here is that it's not like all the truth is on one side. There's truth to the view that says there's a basic human equality. Yes, if you think that man is made in the image of God, and even if you don't, we all need the sun, we all need the air, okay? We're all walking on 2 feet or 1 foot or in a wheelchair. We all have a beating heart. We all have hopes and dreams and aspirations and fears and anxieties. There is a common underlying humanity. And somehow the liberal impulse or leftist impulse is to say that commonality should guide everything that happens. There shouldn't be kind of rank or hierarchy. One of the things that happens when you introduce rank or hierarchy is it seems like the people at the top, and I don't mean here the economic hierarchy, I mean a kind of aristocracy of souls, excellence, as you mentioned. It seems like, look, in the classical models, if you talk about human excellence, you're saying these people are almost godlike. The excellent man is like just about an angel on earth, or a prophet being a sort of superhuman type on earth. And then you think, well, if you have higher types like that, then everybody else is comparatively subhuman. And so the basic commonality of our human existence, on one hand, we want to preserve, but so too we need to preserve these fundamental differences. And that's where the pendulum has swung away from. It's swung in the direction of destroying all relevant differences up to and including basic sexual differentiation, as people know, I think. But the hypocrisy is self-evident because you know that in sports and in other fields, people distinguish themselves by their capacities and by their efforts, putting the lie to the view that we should take everything down to the lowest common denominator. So clearly there are people who are looking for models of greatness. There's a return to Roman models, and to other models that are like, look, why are they trying to destroy this possibility for me? You know, and there's a lot to that. I work at a computer most of the time, most of the day. And I'm not out there riding a horse, slaying villains, or climbing and conquering mountains. And some people say that's because, you know, you've been put into a situation where the higher human possibilities are no longer available to you. Generally speaking, that may be true to an extent. Generally speaking, there may be other reasons for a lack of initiative that people have, myself included at times. So, yeah, I think if we take a broad bird's eye view, not just over the last, you know, whatever you want to consider it, a few months, a few years, a few decades, if you take a long historical view, we live in an era where the highest standard of man's existence is no longer, like it once was, perfection. Perfection of the soul, moral and intellectual perfection, actually trying to be as much as you can be close to the gods. Great statesmen, great legislators, when we see them today, we're inspired by them. People look, again, no personal disrespect to President Biden. You know, it's not like I know him and have met him, but people look to the leaders that we have, and then they look at foreign leaders, and it can be to Bukele and El Salvador, and they see, here is somebody who's taking the state and its future into his hands with decisive action for the common good. Not everybody can do that. You know, when you get into politics, there's a division between the rulers and the ruled. And as Aristotle wrote in his Politics, even when you have a desire to have equality reflected in your political order, so that, for example, you take turns ruling and being ruled, still there's something inherently distinguishing about being a ruler. There's some special privileges that you have when you're in that position, some special responsibilities that you have. So the broad arc of Western thought has been to move things to our common humanity, our common dignity, what we share, and the senses in which we're equal. The classical model really put the emphasis on man's rare perfection, the great heights to which we can attain in a few cases if we happen to be favored by the gods and to have the good fortune for that. People are hungry for models of greatness and excellence. That's why there's, I think, a return to anything that tells us about it. Nietzsche, in his own way, for example, Plato and Aristotle in their own way, contemporary leaders like Bukele. If you're hungry for it, you'll find it. You'll find examples of it. But it's today fighting an uphill battle to try to put the emphasis on excellence when the dominant ideology is equality.
Well, it almost seems to be the case that putting an emphasis on greatness seems like such a futile endeavor at this point, especially in the face of something like AI, which seems to bring forth a future that kind of levels the playing field for everyone. So, you know, if we were to take the Trad Chad's argument seriously, where, again, he sort of argues for a worldview that crime would be eradicated by harsher laws, similar to what's happening in El Salvador with Bukele, as you mentioned, and if the nuclear family was reinstated. And on the other side of the aisle, you know, we have the leftist argument where if we simply committed fully to equality, inclusion, and representation of all people, regardless of, you know, whether or not those people were in like just a percentile minority of the population, we would usher in some sort of like utopia that centers itself around empathy, personal happiness, et cetera. And I guess my question for you is, in the face of AI, do either of these worldviews actually come to full fruition? Is there a way that we can either be great or usher in some sort of utopia of equality?
So about the utopia of equality, I would say it's dangerous to have utopian expectations from politics, as the great teacher of political philosophy, Leo Strauss, once said. He also said that we should not have an unmanly contempt for politics. So we are fated to have politics, and we have to find the right way to engage with it. And for sure, my view is that visionary expectations, like some sort of egalitarian utopia or some sort of a techno-futurist utopia, both of those views are at risk of overlooking exactly what you can expect from politics if you have modest and realistic hopes. So AI is not going to usher in an egalitarian messianic era for several kinds of reasons. I think one is that at the moment it requires incredible computing power, which is concentrated in the hands of the people who can afford it and who can marshal it. And in some cases, you have the difficulty of access to the training models and access to the all the other systems. So today's kind of superhero figures or philosopher king figures are, in some cases, the Silicon Valley tech CEOs who control these huge resources and who are, in some sense, acting like legislators. They're laying down the law for their language models and for their AI systems. And then everybody else is the citizen of those regimes, of those AI regimes, and they have to follow the kind of constitutional order, and they can have a rebellion. So, for example, the people who used the Gemini AI and found that it was way too woke, they put forward their moral protest, and Google had to cut that, nip it at the bud and go back to the board and rewrite their constitution because there was a kind of popular protest or revolution in the face of it. But still, they are the ones who can set down the law. Other people can be users of these systems, but they can't really be the centralized power that controls it, that deploys it, and that has access to everybody's information. To the extent to which, even though we do what we can do to protect our identities, even our protected identities can be cloned and our voices can be. So, the people who have access to that information have a degree of power that we as the users of those systems don't have. I think that's one reason why this egalitarian model can't possibly play out. On the other hand, there will be a democratization of access to these systems and to what they can do. And that's nice. People can use that for high, noble, productive purposes, or for entertainment, or for education, or for whatever they want. So both of those things are at play. The distribution of functional and trustworthy AI systems should help replace certain mundane tasks that people can now do with the benefit of those new devices. But there's no world that I can envision in which it leads to truly egalitarian, all-inclusive paradise of a messianic era kind. No. And no matter what happens with the development of these AI systems, people want to live in safe cities. People don't want to feel like when they go out for a walk at night, they can be robbed or shot or killed. They don't want to be told that a crackhead with a machete is the price you pay for freedom. People want and deserve to get peace, order, and good government. And it's been a teaching in the history of political philosophy for a long time. For example, in Plato's Laws, written more than 2,000 years ago, that there are two extremes: extreme tyranny, which we're all worried about today, and extreme freedom, which we don't talk about as often. Extreme freedom can be a source of decay, degradation, and total chaos. So not everybody likes to hear it, and it's easier said than done, but we have to learn to find the sweet spot, or whatever range there is of tolerable options, between the excess of freedom that leads to degradation, social decay, chaos, anarchy, and the race to the bottom, and the tyranny that deprives people altogether of their God-given freedom, creativity, originality, and right to live a safe life of dignity by themselves and with other people, to some extent, however they want to. And as America is finding its own way around this problem, and other countries are too, they look around the world, they look at the new technologies, they look at the examples, past, present, and they think about how to map that onto a future that makes sense. That's all we can do in some sense. So I don't think that overzealous AI optimism is fully justified, nor do I think that the huge concern about a kind of digital apocalypse is warranted, even if there's a threat at either extreme. We got to make sure, like Alex Karp, the CEO of Palantir, wrote in Time magazine not long ago, we shouldn't shift our responsibility to these systems and the companies that design them and say that, it's just inherent in tech that it's going to do this to us. We need to decide how we're going to use these systems, how they're going to serve us, and the best way to employ them in a flourishing overall life, individually and collectively. So easier said than done, but those are the challenges we face.
Well, touching on what you just mentioned a few minutes ago regarding excess tyranny and excess freedom, I think there's a certain flavor of rage on both sides of the political spectrum, on the right and the left, especially with people my age and younger. I'm 31, but let's say 31 and younger. And I think this rage and the types of problems that we're seeing in the world right now feel very, very new. But you seem to think we've seen these types of problems before, even as close as within the last century. And I'm curious, where in your mind have we seen these problems pop up in the past?
Yeah, now this is the most important point, because with everything that's going on, not only AI, but crime, immigration, war, these divided allegiances and loyalties, cognitive dissonance, what we need most in this situation is, I think, guidance and education. And the beautiful thing, as you begin to study the history of political philosophy, which is what I once had the great fortune of doing, and now I teach these topics, you discover how much the basic political questions and concerns cut across space and time, so that you can open up Plato and Aristotle, as I said, and see something that resonates directly with today's situation. But more recently, Leo Strauss, who I mentioned, a great teacher of the history of political philosophy, in 1941, he gave a talk on German nihilism. So you got to think, German nihilism, 1941. And obviously, he had to acknowledge that for most people, that means National Socialism, the Nazis. But what he said was that Nazism is a species of a more general category, German nihilism, that is actually worth our full attention. And this is a piece of writing that is hugely relevant today as we try to understand right-wing anti-liberalism. Those people who clearly don't want liberalism are disgusted by the socialist or communist alternative. They see marching proletarians under a flag of Marxist communism, and it's a nightmare scenario. You know, they detest both bourgeois liberal capitals who love their private property, peace, and security, and your woke leftists, and they're looking for something. So what Strauss said is that the German nihilists, they have a moral protest against the world of the open society, a world that seems to deprive man of his deep attachments and of his need for moral order. So in Strauss's analysis, German nihilists, they had a justifiable moral passion behind their rejection of liberalism and behind their rejection of the leftist alternative. But they didn't have a clear vision for what they wanted to do. They only had a clear vision of what they wanted to negate. As I say, a world of comfortable self-satisfaction or a world where everybody is equal. Those things were disgusting to them. So Strauss analyzes this, and he, very helpfully, in my view, addresses the following issue. He says one way that these young, atheistic, right-wing anti-liberals, these German nihilists, one way that they felt they could overturn liberalism and leftism is as follows. For liberals, comfortable self-preservation is a very important principle. Like you had said, liberalism gives us a lot of good stuff. You know, if I'm cold, I can turn on the heat. If I'm hot, I can turn on the AC. I'm thirsty, I go pour myself some water from my nice fridge, which has refrigerated water for me. I have everything I want. Comfortable self-preservation. That's a beautiful thing, according to a liberal. And if you're an anti-liberal on the right, they say, look, we're going to throw something down at the feet of comfortable self-preservation, the risk of self-sacrifice, the non-utilitarian virtue, courage, battle, war, death. You want comfortable self-preservation? We're willing to endure uncomfortable self-destruction if that's what it takes to stand for something. So he said the automatic, reflexive, reactionary urge of the young right-wing German nihilists was to put the courage, the virtue of courage and the ability to endure pain and to risk your life at the top of the food chain. You know, human excellence is willingness to kill and die. And that's a total throwdown to the liberals who say, no, we just want peace and comfortable self-existence. But what Strauss said was that there's more to the story of a thought out alternative to liberalism than just the assertion of courage as the key human value. Because, for example, to show you how these conversations go all the way back, in Plato's Laws, in the first chapter, in the first few pages, this question is discussed, and it's specifically stated by the main character in that book that courage is not the highest virtue. It is one of the human excellences, to be sure. It's better to be courageous than to be a coward. And you need courage if you're going to have a military. If you don't have a military, you don't have a political self-existence. But courage is only one of several virtues, which include moderation, justice, and prudence. And all of them are governed, in a sense, by intelligence and by the quest for wisdom and comprehensive knowledge. So the right-wing anti-liberals, the German nihilists, the kind of intelligent Nazis who rejected liberalism, they did it not deeply enough. The deep rejection of liberalism doesn't lead you to Nazism. It leads you to Platonism in this analysis, which is, I think, enough to blow anybody's mind. And the beautiful thing about Strauss's presentation of German nihilism, he said, these young people, they needed something. They had something. They got something right. The moral protest against the open society is legitimate because it's not only something that Hitler had. It's not like, oh, if you have some worry about the liberalism today, you're Hitler. No, because Plato, Rousseau, Nietzsche, they all shared some version of this moral protest against an egalitarian world. And you wouldn't say that Rousseau's Hitler or that Nietzsche's Hitler or that Plato's Hitler. So there's a legitimacy to this moral protest. But what Strauss says is that the young students needed teachers. And they needed, quote unquote, old-fashioned teachers who could show them the legitimacy of their detestation of the liberal and the leftist alternative and guide them intelligently to some moderate, decent, feasible models and not push them even further into the hands of radicals like Hitler. But there weren't old-fashioned teachers. Instead, there were what he says, teachers of quote-unquote progressive education. And these progressive teachers, they couldn't understand their students. They never gave them the light of day. They pushed them further to the right. It's a teacher's obligation to understand why a young man or woman today might have a passionate protest against liberalism and wokeism. If a teacher doesn't understand that, he's liable to do more harm than good. Because as he recites liberal and leftist platitudes, this young right-wing person is going to say, that's just more of the same. These people are so out of touch. They're so clueless. All they can do when push comes to shove is give me more platitudes. And therefore, this is where I think this is hugely relevant for today. I think it is self-evident and obvious that this is the case. When I was a teaching assistant at the University of Toronto in Canada, I had students in this position. Okay, I was just a teaching assistant. I could only say what I could say. They had teachers who couldn't address their deep moral longings. So where do they go to? Well, thankfully for me and you to some extent, they went to YouTube and they find people on YouTube who can speak to their concerns. Now that's good when you can guide their concerns well. But what if they go on YouTube and 3 clicks down the road, I don't know, they're ready to firebomb their school or something like that. God forbid, So the worry that Strauss had was bad teachers are going to screw things up horribly because when they don't understand the nature of that moral protest and they don't understand the authors who speak to it intelligently, they're part of the problem. So to repeat, young nihilists with a legitimate moral protest looking for something to say yes to, but lacking the guidance. Progressive teachers who are just looking to shut them down and shut them up, not helping the situation. And thankfully, I would say Leo Strauss was himself such an old-fashioned teacher who could come to the scene and show people these are old problems. They're old ideas. They recur throughout the ages. They belong to the nature of political life. You're not a freak if you have an issue with egalitarianism destroying the possibility of human greatness. You're not a freak if you think that property acquisition and material gain stands above spiritual values and intellectual pursuits. You're not a freak. In fact, you stand in a long and legitimate line of people who are seeking for a philosophical way of life and who are seeking for political greatness and human greatness. And at the same time, he taught it doesn't mean that you have to go and use vulgar German nihilism of the National Socialist sort. So in 2016, to sum this up, my view is that Trump's victory opened the door in general. It put it back sort of in the center of our attention. The whole world of right-wing anti-liberalism, like Nietzsche, who had been so influential on the left, once again became influential on the right. And the right was beginning to rediscover the intellectual sources through which it could fight intelligently against liberal and woke domination. And my contention is that the history of political philosophy is the best thing that we have access to help us navigate all of those alternatives, the nature of the moral protest, and the roads that are open to us, avoiding the two extremes, as Strauss said, and as I repeat, of unmanly contempt for politics and zealous visionary expectations from it, and finding that world within which we can exercise political prudence without sacrificing the higher possibilities of human existence.
If courage and sacrifice versus happiness and comfort is almost this archetypal debate that's been going on for decades, hundreds of years, and maybe even millennia to a certain extent, I guess the rise of someone like Andrew Tate, who kind of spits in the face of comfort and happiness in favor for more militaristic values, makes a lot more sense. But if the kind of nihilism and the value put on violence you're talking about in pre-World War II Germany was indeed what led to the rise of Hitler, not to be that guy, but it seems like there might be something to the idea of fearing Andrew Tate and his effect over the nihilistic right much more than we fear people obsessed with diversity, equity, and inclusion. So if someone is finding themselves on the right and they're becoming disenchanted with liberalism as a whole, where can they find the education that you're talking about that could potentially lead them towards something in the future that doesn't require us burning everything to the ground?
So there are many different starting points in my view, but I'll give you one that fits a certain kind of trajectory. Carl Schmidt, who was a Nazi, okay? He was a jurist in Nazi Germany. He wrote a book in the 30s called The Concept of the Political. One of the strongest, sharpest, most memorable polemics against liberalism written in our time. The concept of the political is the source of a famous idea that politics is constituted by the friend-enemy distinction. That liberals sort of hide the fact that they have enemies and say that we're all humanity. And if you're not with us, then you're just not part of humanity. You're some sort of savage or beast or animal. But Schmidt reminded us that politics is constituted by the friend-enemy distinction, and he used that as a polemic against liberalism's various hypocrisies. Now, in the expanded edition of his book, included at the end is a piece of writing by Leo Strauss on Schmidt, where he points out Schmidt's own shortcomings. And he doesn't say, you know, Schmidt, you are too right-wing. You know, like you're against liberals and you just are, you know, you're too right-wing because you're setting up friends and enemies, us versus them. A lot of people consider that to be fascism, just the very simple distinction of us versus them. Strauss doesn't say that. He says, in fact, Schmidt, you're still too liberal, which is a hugely unexpected thing to say after you just read, as I mentioned, one of the most scathing polemics against liberalism penned in the last 100 years. So what is Strauss talking about? He says, dear Mr. Schmidt, liberals tolerate, apparently, any way of life so long as it's peaceful. You want to identify as a cat? Go for it. Nobody's going to stop you, okay? Everybody gets their own way of life as long as it's peaceful. He says Schmidt is like a mirror held up to that, but sort of a dark mirror, a black mirror. He says, as Strauss says about Schmidt, you're going to accept any way of life so long as it's willing to kill and die. In other words, because you think the liberal is a pansy, you just want somebody to be, you know, ballsy. As long as they're willing to kill and die, I, Carl Schmidt, accept it. whether you're going to die for Allah or whether you're going to die for Christ or whether you're going to die for this or that, structurally, as long as you're not liberal, for Schmidt, you're good, you're golden. And Strauss says this formalism, like it doesn't really matter what the substantive issue is so long as you demonstrate a willingness to kill and die, as long as you reassert the primacy of the political. Strauss said that empty formalism won't cut it. In fact, the reason there's a friend and enemy distinction is because we fight over the substantive question. What's right and wrong? What's just and unjust? What's good and bad? What is worth pursuing and what is worth not pursuing? What should we honor and what should we dishonor? It's the disputes over substantive questions that legitimate the division between friends and enemies. So there are people today, I think, who want to reject liberalism. They want to assert the primacy of the political. If they read Schmidt's book, they'll get one of the best statements ever made about that problem. But if they follow it up with Strauss's commentary, they'll deepen their understanding of what's at stake in a way that doesn't drive them further into the hands of National Socialist thinkers, but rather returns them to the questions: what is right, what is wrong, what is just, what is unjust, what is good, what is bad. And the way that you study those questions intelligently, or the one way that I know above all other ways to study those questions intelligently, is through the history of political philosophy, because they're raised in Plato and in Aristotle and in Augustine and Aquinas and Machiavelli. And when we learn those thinkers, we actually get the deep DNA and the deep coding behind all of our comparatively superficial understandings of these issues. And that, I think, is the best way to get an education in these topics. And I said there are many different entry points. Schmidt to Strauss is one. Other people start with a contemporary thinker like Alexander Dugin, and they use his analysis of the collapse of liberalism and of the rise of Russia to turn to the thinkers that he mentions and that he learns from, including Plato, Aristotle, and also Heidegger and Nietzsche. So my attitude towards this is, once you begin to uncover the world of these authors who foresaw many of the problems we're dealing with, they foresaw them, as you said, as I said, sometimes 10, sometimes 100, sometimes 1,000, sometimes thousands of years ago. When we begin to discover the world of those thinkers, we gain access to perhaps the most helpful resource in thinking through the various crises of our time, as well as the various possibilities and potentials of our time. Because we shouldn't just be naysayers and doomsayers and believing that everything's going downhill. As always, there are options open to us, perhaps, that are good and that are in accordance with our longings and aspirations. So those are find some way to break through into those books would be my suggestion. And whether it's through Schmidt, whether it's through Dugin, whether it's through some other contemporary thinker. And once you start, don't stop.
Oh, you mentioned Dugin, and I kind of want to use him as perhaps the segue into the last part of our conversation, because based on everything that you're saying, it seems like the best cure to all of these problems that we're talking about isn't so much a complete rejection of the present, but perhaps a, let me read this one more time. Editor, cut that out. So you touched on Dugin a second ago, and I almost want to use him as a segue into the last part of our conversation, because it seems like the best cure to all of the problems that we're talking about isn't so much a complete rejection of the present, but perhaps a vision of the future. But I think when it comes to liberalism, and this is something that you've touched on as well, it seems like since the founding of America anyway, the focus has been on the freedom from tyranny, freedom from taxation without representation, but we never really ended up agreeing on what our freedom would or should bring us closer to in terms of a vision of the future. And the first person that kind of turned me on to this idea of freedom from something rather than freedom towards is, in fact, Alexander Dugin. And I almost wonder, what vision of the future do you think could potentially unite us in such a way where we need to unite to solve the stuff that we're dealing with, instead of just consistently trying to make ourselves free from things that theoretically constrain us?
It's a huge problem, because even the notion of being united has a kind of polemical attack on it, because unity Too much unity. Unity of what? Unity of the nation, unity of the people, unity of the culture, civilization. For a lot of postmodern liberal leftist types, that very idea of a unity of a coherent organism or entity sounds fascistic. You know, unity sounds like a dangerous thing. So even the very desire or drive to have a unified solution to the set of problems, or even a unified analysis, you know, even people understanding what the problems are in a way that's shared. If you ask 10 different people today what the key problems are, I mean, depending on their ideological perspective, they're going to say it's very different. For Biden, the key problem is the rise of MAGA. For MAGA, the key problem is the rise of Biden. So it's very difficult in a situation like that, the much talked about polarization, to even imagine what it would take to have a unified account of the problems and the possibility of a solution that people agree to in unison. So that's number one. And, you know, I'll tell you something about Dugin just quickly in relationship to this question. He has a series of essays published in a book called Political Platonism, where he says, in fact, there's a notion that today's democracy is premised, this maybe will sound weird, maybe not, but hopefully comprehensible. It's premised on the denial of the existence of the one metaphysically. So it's not just that there's inability to get political unity, it's that above the political view of the world, there's a kind of basic metaphysics. What is equality, not politically, but as such? What is unity as such? What is being as such? What is time as such? You know, what's the nature of existence as such? So that the blueprint of modern democracy has programmed into it, like imagine you wrote down the number one and then you crossed it out. So there are no unities, there are only multiplicities. And that any unity we have is a pseudo-unity of multiplicities that came together to form it. So it's like, even it sounds, as I say, maybe abstract or too theoretical, too removed, fine, I allow that. But there are these deep, deep divisions over something so basic as whether to be unified is even a good thing. That makes it very hard, I would say, to imagine something like that. What would be nice, speaking in here as like a centrist, moderate sort, is to find the areas that are maybe less ideologically charged and that can be an easy win for both sides, to look for those sorts of places, or to have the victory in the conquest of one side over another. Because that's another way you can institute a sort of unity, is defeat your enemies, marginalize them, silence them, take them out of the political equation, and then you have your new grouping, and that grouping can find a solution. But yeah, the biggest challenge, again, not to be commonplace about it, people talk about ideological polarization, but you have to think, how can people agree on anything? Well, people should be able to agree, right? Innocents overdosing on drugs that are imported from abroad, you know, and good people with their whole lives ahead of them being, even take an issue like that, people with their whole lives ahead of them being killed by an illegal immigrant, it gets interpreted very differently on the right and on the left. So there have to be statements of the problem that are not so ideologically charged, probably, for the political parties and the political players to be able to find these basic solutions that work, not just that sound good, but that solve the problem, that improve it to some extent. Bukele was facing a problem, rampant crime, and he had to take action, imprisoning gang members, and he got the solution, peace on the streets, comparatively compared to what it was before. So is there a willingness to take decisive action on basic issues that improve the lives of American citizens? It's hard to say. Sometimes it looks like the answer there is no. And especially when you have one side saying improved situation means good policing, and the other one says improved situation means abolishing the police. It's not very easy to see how you're going to find a compromise solution there. So it may be that before even there are practical solutions, there has to be a resolution of these basic fundamental theoretical, ideological, and partisan differences. It's hard to see that happening too. So this isn't, again, to be doomsday. No, somehow you muddle through. Politics is not a well-oiled machine. There are so many factors at play. The American founders knew there's going to be faction where there's freedom. They said that. They said, if you don't want there to be faction and you want there to be freedom, the only way you can make sure that there's unity is to deprive people of their freedom. Because where people are free, people differ. And so we don't even necessarily need to overcome every difference or believe that the world will be a better place if there's no faction. We should follow the wisdom of the founders and the authors of the Federalist Papers, who said the point is to make sure that, if you have fire in the kitchen, you don't want it to burn down your whole house. If you have a faction that's somewhere in your country, you don't want it to be the cause of the destruction of the whole country. But I don't put out the fire by taking out the oxygen, because then I have nothing to breathe and I'm dead. So you don't want to overcome faction by snuffing out freedom if your whole purpose as a government is to protect freedom as much as possible in this unparalleled historical example of a large republic. These are the difficult problems that we can navigate more easily the more familiar we become with their great expositors, as I said, like in the Federalist Papers and so on. But yeah, I don't have great hopes for immediate solutions to any problems. Maybe it's going to take a man of talent or woman, a man of talent, ability, and will to take power one way or another, hopefully by legal, appropriate, and decent means, and to impose their will on people who are there to be imposed upon. I mean, sometimes that's how it happens in politics. It doesn't always go in a smooth way. The forces that are strong take control and hopefully implement solutions that are good, even if people didn't ask for them, even if people didn't say they want them, and even if there's ideological opposition. That's how you have to navigate with prudence in a world of faction, and that's what we have to deal with.
Michael, where can people find you online if they want to consume more of your work?
My books are available at duganbook.com. That's the easy redirecting URL. I teach at millermanschool.com, and my YouTube channel, youtube.com/Millerman. You could find me on Twitter, where I'm I post less serious things, just entertain myself there. But my school and my books are the main places to go look for people who want to know more about the authors that I've talked about.
Well, Michael, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.